Mr. Cohen, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, just some opening comments I think that will help frame where the administration is at this point in the budget process as we start the conference committee. First, it's worth remembering the goals of the administration. They remain the same as they have since January. The number one budget goal is to make sure our budget is balanced this year and remains so in the out years. We've done a remarkable job over the last 2 years in changing our fiscal fortunes and maintaining that, not just for the short term, but for the long term, is at the top of the administration's priorities. Second, paying down debt. We've obviously focused quite a bit on the $35 billion wall of debt. We have a multi-year plan, and staying with that multi-year plan helps us increase our fiscal capacity. And then third priority, as has been the case all year, is that this budget does provide us an opportunity to make some targeted investments. The passage of Proposition 30 allows us to invest in education and finally begin rebuilding our education system from the difficult cuts that have been made over the last number of years. And the passage of federal health care reform provides us an opportunity to make a dramatic shift in how health care is delivered and how much health care can be delivered within the state of California. So as I said, our fiscal outlook is dramatically better than it was 28 months ago. But we continue to be concerned that our fiscal balance is only by a narrow margin. And so we are cautious, and we want to be responsible with the opportunity that the voters have given us with Proposition 30 to both rebuild, but also to avoid the boom and bust that we've seen in recent years. There do remain billions of dollars of risks and pressures, and it's worth remembering when we say that we've achieved structural balance, meaning in future years we would not spend more than we are projected to take in. That is based on the continuation of all of the difficult choices we've made over the last number of years. So all of our forecasts assume the continuation of those policies that have been adopted in recent years. We certainly appreciate the work of the Senate and the Assembly to get to this point and to bring their versions of the budget into conference committee. But at this point, the administration is not comfortable with either of the versions of the budget that are in conference, and there's no reason to tiptoe around. It's primarily based on the revenue forecasts that both houses have adopted. As we'll talk about more, the Legislative Analyst forecast is $3.2 billion higher than the May revision forecast. About 80% of that is due to capital gains. As both our office and the LAO have told you over the years, capital gains are by far our most volatile revenue, very closely tied to the stock market, which is impossible to predict. It's worth noting, I think some have thought that the May revision, we're not willing to rely on a reasonable estimate of capital gains. That's very far from accurate. In fact, the May revision, roughly 8% of our major tax revenues are expected to come from capital gains. So we are already highly leveraged on the volatility of capital gains, and it's really a matter of, do we bet high and go even higher? Under the LAO's forecast, you would be creeping up to roughly 10% of our tax revenues being reliant on capital gains, and for the administration, that's not an acceptable risk. We certainly do acknowledge and thank both houses for attempting to mitigate some of that risk with the higher revenue forecast. Certainly the Senate has done more in that regard, but both houses took steps to try to mitigate the risk. But at the end of the day, both versions of the budget are making ongoing spending commitments that we don't believe the state can afford to make. The capital gains, they may be here for a month, a year, 2 years, but we've seen their volatility, and to build in new ongoing commitments, particularly entitlements, is not something the administration is willing to do. In addition, as I mentioned, the current state of the budget relies on all of those changes we've made over the last 28 months. And so to start undoing many of those changes that were put in place specifically to mitigate risk and reduce our costs is not the right way to go. So ultimately, now is the time to try to learn from the past and act on it. We've seen over the last 12, 15 years, our budget is increasingly reliant on the volatile revenues, and that's something that we need to manage. It's worth noting that in the dot-com boom, the mid-2000s, no one thought they were acting irresponsibly. There was the expectation that those revenues would continue. The dot-com boom, there was a mix of one-time spending and ongoing spending, but clearly history has shown us that we were counting on much higher ongoing levels of revenue than the state could actually afford. And it's led us into the rough last 5 years, and the administration's not looking to repeat that.
Let's not overlook that $6 billion tax cut from the previous administration as well.
Of course, that is one of those pressures and costs in the budget that we've been driving uphill to try to overcome, certainly in the last 7-8 years. So. The Chair mentioned already the positive May revenue that you may have heard about. That's certainly good news. We're always happy when we finish a month above expectations rather than the opposite, below expectations. But again, just looking 2 years ago, we built the 2011-12 budget on the expectation that a healthy June would lead to higher revenues in the upcoming year. That clearly didn't turn out, and in fact, even though June revenues were up by over $500 million, when we were done with all the accruals and the adjustments, the 2010-11 year actually ended up below expectations rather than above expectations. So all of that is to say that we're here to work with you, but the administration's not comfortable with the basis of your budgets with the revenue forecast. And so as we go through all of the issues, that lack of comfort will make it clear to you as we get to those issues that increase costs and increase risk.
We don't have a fundamental difference with the administration about the need to be cautious here. Capital gains revenue is highly volatile. This is the time, as Senator Emerson mentioned, which we'd love to be building up the reserve. Unfortunately, again, you don't really have that option because of the requirement, again, on the method we've elected to use. It goes to school spending. You don't have the option to reserve a lot of this money. And that's really unfortunate, because this is the time that you would want to be building up your reserve. But the two houses have said, in effect, within our spending plan, our one-time payments for buying down deferrals to schools, we're going to have a piece of those that is contingently provided to schools. That is, as soon as we know for sure that the guarantee is this high to support that level of spending, then the money can go out to schools. If it's not, that spending in effect goes away. It's like a built-in reserve within the Proposition 98 budget, and that's a very smart thing to do. The houses differed in the amounts that they did, and I think most importantly, if you look again at the 13-14, the Senate had $1.1 billion, that's this sort of reserve. The Assembly was quite a bit less. And again, I just want to link that back up to the fact that our revenues are so much higher in the budget year. Clearly, the Senate does provide greater protection against that fall off, but at the expense of you're not being able to make commitments to school spending that you might otherwise like to make. The next line just shows you, as a result of the different plans, what is the increase in ongoing commitments from the current year, 12-13, to the budget year for schools. The administration, even under its plan, you have almost $3 billion in new spending commitments. The Senate adds about $600 million on top of that. The Assembly provides quite a bit more, primarily to the local control funding formula, but also to some child care and to some other programs. All three plans assume savings from the redirection to the counties related to the Affordable Care Act. You have a line item here on the loan from cap and trade. All three versions have roughly the same, although the Assembly reserved $100 million from the loan to the program in effect. And you see on the bottom line that both houses did increase the level of the reserve, again, as a way of mitigating, to some degree, what Mr. Cohen mentioned, the prospects that if revenues are not as high as you've assumed, you have some protection against that. I want to talk a little bit about revenues and risk. As has been talked about, May, which is a very small revenue month, was very good, and it was on withholding, which is more an indicator of current economic activity, of the sort of more stable sources of income, salaries and wages and things like that. And it is a good sign. But as Mr. Cohen noted, the real key is going to be June. That's our second estimated payment. And our hope, obviously, is that the year-to-year increase of June estimated payments from last year, the percentage increase, will be similar to what we experienced in April, which was very high. There's not a lot of reason to think that it won't be good, but again, as Mr. Cohen noted, there's lots of things that have happened in recent times with tax changes at both the federal and state level, changes to our tax structure. We don't know what could happen, but I think the prospects are fairly good. Unfortunately, we're not going to know that until after you have to send the governor a budget package. So we're still very comfortable with our revenue estimates. We don't think they're optimistic in any sense. The issue is really around the volatility. We would acknowledge that our estimates and the administration's estimate can easily be wrong by $2 or $3 billion plus or minus in any given year. So in that sense, their estimate is well within our sort of confidence interval, as the statisticians would say. The reason we've highlighted it is because it's all focused in PIT, in personal income, and it's basically, as Mr. Cohen said, focused on capital gains. We think we have a strong basis for our estimate, but again, we would acknowledge, too, the volatility around these numbers. So when we came out with our numbers in our May revision overview, we stressed once again the important need to be cautious about them and to build in your reserves. And both houses have done that to some degree. But if you get to the last line, let me just take the Senate plan as an example. It uses reserves to negate a lot of the risk that the administration seems most concerned about. And just again, using their plan as an example, on the school spending, they've addressed about 2/3 of the risk associated with our higher revenues. That is, if we're completely wrong and they're right on, you would have adjusted downward about 2/3 of the higher Proposition 98 spending. So you would have kind of mitigated much of the risk they talk about. More importantly, just again taking the Senate as just an example, it would be very easy for you to make a small adjustment in your language on those reserves, to make a slightly greater portion of those pay downs of the deferrals to where you could mitigate all of the risk associated with the school spending. It wouldn't affect any ongoing decisions you might make about your 98 funding. It would mean that schools could not count on that pay down of the deferrals. They'd have to wait a little bit longer. Not a lot of programmatic effects, but if you were to make, again, as I suggested, a small change in your language of how much of those deferral pay downs you were willing to reserve, you could mitigate all of the risk on the school spending, which is most of the additional spending. And then you can see that in the Senate plan, again, it's just an example, you've already mitigated about half of the remaining risk. So if you were to do that, you would have addressed about 90% of the risk of higher spending that the administration seems so concerned about. Now, granted, that still leaves a small amount, but I think putting it in perspective, you have tools available to you if you wish to address virtually all of the administration's concern in this area.